Nero is usually remembered as the mad emperor who played music while Rome burned, but that image is almost too perfect, more like a moral fable than history. The truth is not that Nero was innocent. The truth is more uncomfortable. He was cruel, vain, and dangerous, but later memory also made him a very convenient monster. Once an emperor becomes a joke, complexity disappears. Fire, poverty, political hatred, palace murder, and imperial anxiety all shrink into one line: Nero fiddled. But in AD 54, he did not enter history as a monster. He entered it as a 16-year-old boy placed on the most dangerous chair in the world. That chair was the Roman throne. Whoever sat there held almost unlimited power, while being watched by the Senate, the army, the palace, his mother, and the crowd. Nero was born into a family that was never truly safe. The Julio-Claudian dynasty looked glorious from outside, but inside it was filled with poison, exile, marriages, and fear. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was not an ordinary mother. She was intelligent, ambitious, politically sharp, and painfully aware that softness rarely survived in Rome. She helped bring Nero close to power, but she also shaped him as her political instrument. His rise was not only family pride, it was her survival strategy. Emperor Claudius adopted Nero and placed him ahead of his own son, Britannicus. This was not a household decision, it was a rewriting of imperial succession. So when Nero became emperor, Rome did not see a cartoon villain. Many saw a manageable young ruler who might begin a gentler chapter. The early years of Nero's rule were not instantly insane. Real power rested with Seneca, Burrus, and Agrippina, the adults standing behind the teenage emperor. During these years, Nero could even be packaged as a good emperor: lighter taxes, respect for the Senate, public mercy, at least on the surface. This is the first contrast later memory often forgets. Nero did not begin by screaming from a throne and burning cities. He began as a controlled boy king. But the problem was already forming. Teach a teenager that he is the center of the world, then treat him as a puppet, and rebellion becomes almost inevitable. Agrippina wanted to control her son. Nero wanted to escape his mother. Inside the Roman palace, their relationship became a power struggle with no gentle exit. Britannicus made everything even more dangerous. As Claudius's natural son, he remained a living reminder that Nero's claim could always be questioned. In AD 55, Britannicus suddenly died during a banquet. Ancient writers believed he was poisoned, and Nero was the most obvious person who benefited. This is hard to explain away kindly. Even if every detail cannot be proven, it points toward a dark truth. Throne security mattered more than family life. From here, Nero was no longer only the person being controlled. He was becoming the person who controlled, feared, and removed threats. But his greatest shadow was still his mother. Agrippina was the reason he reached the throne, and the reason he could not fully possess it. Ancient historians gave the story dramatic details: boats, plots, failed murder attempts, and panic. The details may be embroidered, but the ending is not. In AD 59, Agrippina was killed. Nero murdered his mother, or at least approved the outcome. Rome could no longer see him as an ordinary young ruler. Matricide was one of the darkest moral crimes in the ancient world. It was not just a political killing, it felt like the tearing of nature itself. After that, every strange habit of Nero's could be reinterpreted as a sign of corruption. Singing was not just singing, performance became evidence of imperial collapse. Nero truly loved art. He enjoyed music, theater, poetry, and public competition, especially appearing before audiences and receiving applause for himself. To modern viewers, a ruler who loves performance might sound merely vain. To Roman elites, an emperor appearing on stage was close to social self-destruction. Roman nobles could sponsor art, but they were not supposed to perform like professional entertainers. Actors had low status, and Nero blurred a line elites hated. This is one reason his image became so extreme. He was not only cruel, he offended Roman elite ideas of dignity, class, and masculine authority. If an emperor killed people, the Senate feared him. If an emperor forced nobles to listen to his singing, the Senate hated him and remembered every note. Nero's enemies later told many stories about his ridiculous performances. Some may be true, some exaggerated, but together they created a theatrical tyrant. In that version, Nero was not a complicated political figure. He was a narcissistic actor who turned the empire into a stage. That image traveled easily. But to understand why Nero became this image, we cannot look only at personality. We also have to look at the tensions inside Roman power itself. The emperor needed the people's love, the army's loyalty, and the Senate's cooperation, while pretending that each group still mattered most. Nero often appeared generous to ordinary Romans. He offered entertainment, games, grain, and public spectacle, which helped urban crowds imagine him as their patron. But generosity needed money. Money came from taxes, confiscations, provinces, rich estates, and increasingly strained financial arrangements. The more Nero courted the people, the more he angered elites. The more he became a people's performer emperor, the more nobles felt Rome was being humiliated. Then came the event that pushed Nero into historical hell, the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. The fire spread through crowded, flammable, chaotic districts. Wooden structures, narrow streets, shops, and wind helped the flames swallow huge sections of the city. The famous image shows Nero standing above the destruction, watching Rome burn while he plays music or sings, but that image has serious problems. First, the modern fiddle did not exist in Nero's Rome. If he played anything, it would have been a lyre-like instrument, not the fiddle of the saying. More importantly, the ancient sources do not fully agree. Tacitus mentions rumors that Nero sang about Troy's destruction, but he identifies them as rumors. Tacitus also says Nero was away in Antium when the fire began. After hearing the news, he returned and opened buildings to shelter victims. That does not automatically make Nero a hero, but it does make the classic image of him enjoying the fire from above deeply questionable. After the fire, Nero introduced rebuilding measures, including wider streets, height limits, and more fire-resistant construction. These policies do not fit a simple madman cartoon. Yet Nero also built his enormous golden house on land cleared after the disaster. To many Romans, that looked less like recovery and more like motive. If a city burns and the emperor builds a luxury palace in the ruins, people do not need perfect evidence to become suspicious. Rumors began to grow. Maybe Nero wanted to rebuild Rome. Maybe he wanted land for his palace. Maybe the fire was not an accident. The most dangerous rumors in history do not have to be fully true. They only need to sound like the person people already believe you are. Nero was already seen by many as vain, extravagant, unserious, and cruel. So when Rome burned, many could believe, of course he would do it. That is the power of a label. A person's past sins can make every future disaster look like evidence of guilt. Nero needed to redirect anger. According to Tacitus, he blamed the Christians, an unpopular and easily suspected small group in Rome. For early Christian memory, this mattered enormously. Nero was not merely a bad emperor. He became a persecutor, later even linked with the image of Antichrist. Christians were punished brutally. Tacitus describes public executions, humiliation, and extreme violence, leaving Nero's name deeply stained in Christian tradition. This is the second reason Nero's image became so extreme. Senatorial hatred and Christian condemnation overlapped, creating two powerful lines of hostile memory. Many of the people who shaped Nero's memory were not his friends. Senatorial writers disliked his politics, and Christian writers remembered persecution. When your enemies control memory, your story does not become fairer. It usually becomes clearer, more moralized, and far more ruthless. But that does not mean Nero should be turned into a victim. His rule involved real crimes, especially family killings, political purges, and violent repression. His first wife, Octavia, was exiled and executed. She had public sympathy, but Nero wanted Poppaea and chose a brutally political solution. Poppaea also died during Nero's reign. Ancient sources say Nero kicked her while pregnant, but modern historians are often more cautious about that detail. These stories reveal the pattern. Many deaths around Nero were real, but later writers often shaped each death into a monster story. He may not have committed every absurd crime told about him, but he committed enough terrible acts that people were willing to believe more. That is what makes Nero difficult. He was both a victim of hostile memory and a maker of violence, exaggerated by enemies, yet guilty enough to feed them. In AD 65, the Pisonian conspiracy was uncovered. Senators, equestrians, and intellectuals were implicated, and Nero's fear hardened into a broader purge. Seneca also died in the aftermath. The man who once taught Nero restraint and mercy was swallowed by the political terror of his former student's reign. After this conspiracy, the bridge between Nero and Rome's elites was almost broken. He was no longer merely embarrassing, he was someone they wanted removed. Meanwhile, the empire's edges were not calm. Boudicca's revolt shook Britain, Parthian tensions pressed the east, and Judea moved toward major rebellion. Nero's Rome was not a stable stage, it was an empire with cracks everywhere. His failure was not just personal weakness, it was pressure inside the system. But popular memory dislikes systems. Systems are complicated, finances are dull, and imperial administration is hard to dramatize. A mad emperor is easier. So Nero became a container for every fear. Roman anxiety, aristocratic resentment, Christian trauma, and later fantasies of tyranny all gathered inside his name. Nero himself helped create that image. He kept pursuing performance glory, even traveling to Greece for artistic and athletic competitions, enjoying declared victories. To him, this may have been self-expression and escape from Roman political poison. To elites in Rome, it looked like imperial disgrace. If an emperor wins on a battlefield, he becomes a conqueror. If he demands applause on stage, he becomes very easy to remember as a clown. Nero's problem was not simply that he loved art, it was that he could not separate private desire from public power. When power demands applause, art stops being art and becomes a test of obedience. No one knows whether the audience is moved or afraid. That made Nero's artistic life unsettling. He may have loved music sincerely, but the empire had to cooperate with his self-image. By the end of his reign, financial pressure, aristocratic hatred, provincial unrest, and military politics began to merge. Performance and fear could no longer hold everything together. In AD 68, Vindex rebelled in Gaul. Then Galba in Spain became a political alternative, and the army began calculating who deserved loyalty. The most dangerous moment for a Roman emperor was not when people mocked him. It was when soldiers wondered whether the empire would work better without him. When the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, his world collapsed quickly. The court, applause, and fear surrounding him suddenly felt hollow. Nero fled Rome and eventually died by suicide. He was only 30 years old, yet history had already prepared a place for him among its darkest emperors. His death did not bring stability. Instead, Rome entered the year of the four emperors, and civil war exposed the danger left after the Julio-Claudians. That matters because Nero's failure did not die with Nero. Succession, military loyalty, and political legitimacy remained dangerously unresolved. If Nero had only been a madman, his death should have solved the problem. Instead, his death opened a larger crack. That is why the label Mad Emperor is useful but misleading. It explains part of the story while hiding much more. Nero's cruelty was real. The deaths of Britannicus, Agrippina, Octavia, political enemies, and persecuted Christians cannot simply be brushed aside. But Nero's legend was also constructed. It grew from political hatred, class disgust, religious memory, and literary storytelling layered over time. He fiddled while Rome burned, survived because it was useful. It turned complex failure into a single unforgettable picture. A city burns and a ruler performs. It is the ultimate metaphor for bad leadership. The people suffer while power listens to its own voice. So even if the detail is doubtful, the symbol remains powerful. Historical fact and historical fable become almost impossible to separate in Nero's case. Nero was not the first person written by his enemies, and he was not the last, but he is one of the clearest examples. If he were completely innocent, the legend might not have held. If the legend were completely true, the history would not be this complicated. He did kill, he did persecute, and he did turn imperial power into personal theater. But he may not have set Rome on fire or laughed through music. The Nero later generations preferred was easy to understand: madman, performer, arsonist, persecutor, one name large enough to hold every kind of tyranny. The real Nero is harder. A boy pushed upward by his mother, an emperor who killed her, an artist who abused power. He pleased crowds and humiliated elites. He rebuilt the city and built the Golden House. He was swallowed by rumors and created fear with his own hands. That is why his image became so extreme, not because later history simply lied, but because it organized complex ugliness into the perfect monster. Perfect monsters are dangerous because they stop us from thinking. We stop asking why the system allowed him power or who benefited from his image. We remember fire and music, but real history often hides in the political choices before the fire and the memory war after the music. Nero's story is also about how power can consume the young. At 16, he received the world without the maturity or boundaries to survive it. It is also about how palaces manufacture monsters. Everyone used the young emperor until the young emperor learned to use others more brutally. It is also about elite memory taking revenge. Nero insulted senatorial culture, so that tradition did not write him as tragedy, it wrote him as shame. At the same time, it is about victim memory. For early Christians, Nero was not a political misunderstanding. He was pain, death, and persecution. None of these memories can simply be erased. Senatorial hatred was biased, Christian trauma was grounded, and popular nostalgia suggests a more complicated picture. After Nero died, several so-called false Neros appeared, men claiming to be him and gaining support. That means some people remembered more than a monster. Why would anyone miss him? Perhaps because he was generous to urban crowds, or because legendary emperors are easier to romanticize than real successors. This does not prove Nero was a good emperor. It proves that Roman memory of him was never only one color. History eventually chose the brightest color. Fire red, flames, blood, the Golden House, stage lights, and martyrdom all stained his name. Nero became a template for tyranny. When later people wanted to describe cold, extravagant, absurd, cruel leadership, his name was ready. But if we use him only as an example, we miss the deeper question. Why do complex societies love blaming collapse on one strange person? Because strange people make history easier to tell. Structures are uncomfortable because they mean many people participated, stayed silent, or benefited. Nero was guilty, but handing every Roman ugliness to Nero is also a kind of historical escape. The better question is this: what kind of world places a 16-year-old boy in absolute power, then watches him become what everyone fears? What kind of political culture turns art into humiliation, applause into fear, and historical writing into revenge? And what kind of memory lets one urban fire overpower policy, war, finance, class conflict, and religious trauma until it becomes one man's eternal label? Did Nero really only burn Rome and fiddle? No, that answer is too simple and far too convenient. But was Nero just a misunderstood artist? Also no, that is equally simple and unfair to the people who died under his rule. The sharper answer is this: Nero was a genuinely cruel emperor, transformed by genuine enemies and genuine fear into an even larger historical monster. His life reminds us that historical labels rarely come from nowhere, but they rarely equal the whole truth. They begin with facts, grow in hatred, and harden through repetition. In the end, Nero may not have played music while Rome burned, but after Rome burned, history composed a dark song for him that never stopped. And what we hear today may not be the sound of the fire itself. It may be the echo of victors, victims, enemies, and storytellers performing together.